Stop working harder. That sentence alone will cost most people their careers, because they were never taught what work actually is. The world told you that more hours equal more results. It lied. The most productive people on Earth are not grinding 16 hours a day in dim offices. They are finishing empires before lunch. Not because they are gifted. Not because they have more hours than you. But because they understand one brutal truth that nobody posts on a motivational calendar. Time does not produce output. Energy does. Focus does. Constraint does. In the next 90 minutes, you will not receive inspiration. You will receive a system. The same system that high performers have been quietly using for decades, while everyone else stayed busy being busy. 4 hours. Maximum output. Starting now. Chapter 1. The 8-Hour Illusion. Somewhere right now, a person is sitting at a desk for the 9th hour in a row, exhausted, behind on everything, and completely convinced that the problem is that they did not work hard enough. That belief is the lie. Not a small lie. Not a harmless misunderstanding. A foundational, structural, generational lie that has been woven into the way most people understand work, time, and their own value. And because everyone around them believes the same lie, no one questions it. No one steps back. No one asks where it came from. So let us ask. The 40-hour workweek was not designed for you. It was not designed with your output in mind, your creative capacity, or your cognitive potential. It was engineered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to regulate factory workers operating physical machinery on assembly lines. Henry Ford formalized it. Labor legislation codified it. And then, without revision, without examination, an industrial scheduling framework built for repetitive manual labor was handed to doctors, writers, analysts, engineers, and strategists, and everyone agreed to pretend it still made sense. The truth is this: the container was built for a different kind of work. You are pouring a completely different substance into it and wondering why nothing fits. Knowledge work does not operate in shifts. Creative output does not clock in. Strategic thinking cannot be scheduled from 9 to 5 and then switched off for lunch. The architecture of the modern workday is a factory relic being used to govern work that has nothing in common with factory production. And billions of people have accepted it without a single serious question. Most people react to that reality by working longer hours. You choose to understand the structure you are working in. What actually fills 8 hours? Now look honestly at the day. Not the idea of the day. The actual day. The morning email sweep that stretches into 40 minutes. The meeting that could have been 3 sentences in a document. The status update was delivered during a 1-hour call to demonstrate that progress is underway. The Slack thread that pulls 6 people into a conversation that resolves nothing. The rereading of work that was already finished, because being busy with it feels safer than submitting it and being judged on it. This is not work. This is the performance of work. Researchers at Microsoft and Stanford have studied this pattern in detail. The consistent finding is that the average knowledge worker is genuinely productive and genuinely focused on high-value output for fewer than 3 hours in a standard workday. The remaining 5 hours are spent on an activity that simulates productivity without producing it. 3 hours of real output. 5 hours of theater. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. That is not a motivational phrase. It is an operational diagnosis. Busyness is a defense mechanism. It protects people from the one question that actually matters. Is what I am doing producing a result that would not exist without me? If you are always moving, you never have to stop and answer that question. You can point to the motion and call it progress. You can point to the hours and call them effort. And no one, including yourself, ever has to measure what was actually built. The truth is that most professional environments reward performance far more consistently than they reward results. Presence gets praised. Long hours get noticed. Output, unless it is dramatic, often goes unremarked. So people optimize for what gets rewarded. They perform. They stay visible. They fill the time. This is where most people stop. They see the problem clearly, feel a flash of recognition, and then return to their inbox because the alternative feels too uncertain. Changing the way you work means being willing to be measured solely on results, with no performance to hide behind. That is uncomfortable. Most people do not go there. This chapter is asking you to go there. What the clock is really saying. Picture a clock. Standard face, 12 numbers, hands moving. Now replace every number on that face with a single word, wasted. Not because all time is wasted, but because any hour spent performing productivity instead of producing something real is an hour that cannot be recovered, defended, or pointed to with honesty. That clock is already running. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And once you can see the costume clearly, you cannot unsee it. You now understand what the container is and why it was built. You understand that the average workday is not a productivity system. It is a compliance system wearing productivity's clothes. Now it is time to understand the law that governs all of it, the single principle that explains why work expands, why deadlines slip, and why compression is the most powerful tool available to you. Chapter 2. Parkinson's Law is Ruthless. You have already seen the costume. You have already recognized that the 8-hour workday was not built for your output. It was built for compliance. And now a harder question surfaces. If the container is broken, why does filling it with more time never seem to fix anything? Because time is not the variable you think it is. The problem is not that you have too little of it. The problem is that time, left without constraint, does not organize itself around your best work. It organizes itself around your lowest resistance. And there is a law precise and unsentimental that explains exactly why. In 1955, a British naval historian and author, Cyril Northcote Parkinson, published a short, sardonic essay in The Economist. His opening line was this: "Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion." He wrote it as a critique of bureaucratic bloat, an observation that government departments grew larger without becoming more effective. He intended it as wit. What he produced was one of the most operationally accurate laws in all of human behavior. Give a person a week to complete a task that genuinely requires 4 hours, and they will use the entire week. Not because they are lazy. Not because they are undisciplined. But because the brain, without a hard constraint pressing against it, redistributes cognitive effort across the full time available. It revisits decisions already made. It refines what was already sufficient. It adds layers of preparation that never arrive at execution. It mistakes movement through the time block for progress toward the result. The truth is that the deadline does not change the task. It changes the brain's relationship to the task. And that changes everything. Parkinson's law is not a theory about character. It is a theory about cognitive architecture, about how the human mind allocates attention and urgency depending on how far away the pressure point is. When a deadline is distant, the brain classifies the task as low priority. Not consciously. Not as a decision you make at your desk. The classification occurs at a neurological level, within the same threat assessment and reward calculation systems that have governed human survival for hundreds of thousands of years. A distant deadline does not trigger urgency. And without urgency, the brain allows the full menu of cognitive drift to take hold: distraction, perfectionism, revision spirals, the compulsive need to research just a little more before starting, the gentle convincing of yourself that preparation is the same as production. Most people react to a distant deadline by spreading the work thin across the available time. You choose to compress the work into the smallest container that forces execution. When a hard constraint is introduced, when the pressure point moves close enough to be felt physically, the cognitive architecture shifts. The prefrontal cortex stops entertaining options and starts committing to a path. The brain begins eliminating everything that does not directly serve completion. The perfectionism quiets. The revision spiral stops. The distraction loses its pull. Not because willpower increased, Because the cost of distraction became visible and immediate, the brain responded accordingly. Constraint is not a punishment. Constraint is a performance trigger. April 1970. 3 astronauts on board Apollo 13, more than 200,000 miles from Earth, were facing a carbon dioxide buildup in the lunar module that would kill them within hours if unresolved. The carbon dioxide scrubbers on the command module were square. The ones on the lunar module were round. The materials available were exactly what the crew had brought with them: plastic bags, cardboard covers from flight manuals, duct tape, and a sock. NASA engineers in Houston had to design a working solution using only those materials and deliver the instructions verbally across a deteriorating radio connection. They had approximately 3 hours. They solved it. The truth is that this was not a story about genius. It was not a story about NASA being extraordinary, though it was that too. It was a story about what the human brain does when the deadline is not a calendar entry but a life-or-death threshold. The committees were gone. The revisions were gone. The politics of who owned which part of the problem were gone. What remained was the constraint and the task. And the task got done. This is Parkinson's law at its most visible. Under infinite deliberation, the problem grows to fill the available complexity. Under lethal constraint, the brain finds what works and commits. The principle does not require a spacecraft crisis to apply. It scales directly to your Tuesday afternoon. It scales to the report you have been circling for 3 days. It scales to the project that has been in progress for 2 weeks and is exactly as done as it was on day 4. The mechanism is identical. Only the stakes differ. This is where most people stop. They understand the law clearly, they recognize it operating in their own calendar, and then they wait for external pressure to create the constraint for them. They wait for the client to move the deadline up. They wait for the manager to set a firm date. They wait for urgency to arrive from outside rather than engineering it from inside. That waiting is itself an expression of Parkinson's law. The decision to impose the constraint has all the time in the world, so it expands indefinitely. The person who understands this law does not wait. They manufacture the constraint deliberately. They book the presentation before the slides are finished. They set the internal deadline 2 days before the real one and treat the consequences as identical. They give themselves 4 hours for the task that the week would have consumed, and they begin with the understanding that 4 hours is what it will take, not because 4 hours is all they want to spend, but because 4 hours is all they are willing to give. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And one of the most effective ways to keep wearing that costume is to give yourself so much time that the costume never has to come off. Consider your current workload honestly. Not theoretically. The actual list of what is sitting unfinished on your plate right now. The report. The proposal. The decision has been pending for 11 days. The project that is 80% complete and somehow never reaches 100. Now ask, if every deadline on that list moved forward by 50% tomorrow, how much of what you believed required a week would be finished by Thursday? The answer is almost everything. Not because you would suddenly become more capable, but because the constraint would force your brain to stop performing work and start producing it. The quality would not drop. The quantity of real output would rise. The theater would disappear. What would remain is what was always there, your actual ability, operating at its actual ceiling, no longer padded with time it did not need. The truth is that you are more capable than your deadlines have been allowing you to demonstrate. Not potential capability. Current, existing, available capability that has been spread across too much time and diluted into the performance of effort rather than the delivery of results. Parkinson's law does not judge you for this. It simply describes what time without constraint produces. The judgment is yours to apply. You now understand why the container fails and why more time is not the solution. You understand that the brain does not rise to the level of available time. It falls to it. And you understand that the lever is constrained, not duration. But constraint alone is incomplete without understanding what powers the work inside those compressed hours. Because time is the container, and constraint is the shape of that container. What actually fills it, what determines whether 4 focused hours produce more than 8 diluted ones, is not time at all. It is energy. Chapter 3. Forget time. Manage energy. The last chapter left you with a question about your deadlines. About how much of what you believed required a week could actually be finished by Thursday if the constraint were real. That question was not rhetorical. It was a diagnostic. And if you sat with it honestly, you already felt the answer somewhere, in an uncomfortable place. But here is what that question did not address. Compression works. Constraint works. Parkinson's law is real and operational, and you can use it starting tomorrow. But there is a variable underneath all of it that determines whether those compressed hours produce your best work or just faster mediocre work. And almost no one talks about it directly, because it is less visible than a calendar and harder to measure than a deadline. That variable is energy. Not time. Not schedule. Not willpower. Energy. The actual biological, neurological, and cognitive fuel that determines the quality of everything you produce inside whatever time block you have protected. 2 people can sit down at the same desk at the same hour with the same task in front of them. One of them is rested, clear, and physically capable of sustained focus. The other is depleted, running on caffeine and 4 hours of broken sleep, checking their phone every 6 minutes without deciding to. They both work for 4 hours. They do not produce the same output. Not even close. The truth is that time is a container. Energy is what you pour into it. And a container without substance is just an empty box with a label. Most people react to exhaustion by adding more hours. You choose to protect the quality of the hours you already have. This distinction is the foundation that separates high-output professionals from high-effort professionals. Effort is visible. Output is measurable. And the bridge between them is not more time on the clock. It is the energy state you bring to the time you have already committed to. Jim Loehr and Tony Schwartz spent decades studying performance across elite athletes, military personnel, surgeons, and executives. Their conclusion was not complicated but precise. Performance is not a time management problem. It is an energy management problem. The most productive people they studied were not working more hours than everyone else. In many cases, they were working fewer. But the hours they worked were protected, fueled, and aligned with their biological capacity for peak output. They were not grinding through depletion and calling it dedication. They were managing their energy the way a competitive athlete manages their body before a championship. The human brain does not operate at a flat, consistent level of capacity across an 8-hour day. It operates in waves. Researchers call these ultradian rhythm cycles of approximately 90 to 120 minutes of heightened neurological alertness, followed by a physiological trough in which the brain signals its need for recovery. The signals are not subtle. Yawning. Difficulty concentrating. The urge to stand up or move. A wandering mind that keeps pulling away from the screen. A sudden and intense interest in checking something that was not interesting 10 minutes ago. These are not signs of weakness. They are not signs of distraction or poor discipline. They are biological directives. The brain is communicating a clear operational message. The current cycle is complete, recovery is required, and attempting to continue at full cognitive output without that recovery will result in diminishing returns. Most people override these signals. They pour another coffee, push harder, tell themselves that discipline means ignoring the body's requests, and spend the next 2 hours producing work at a fraction of the quality they were capable of an hour earlier. They are present. They are busy. They are wearing the costume. But the output they generate in that depleted state would embarrass them if they reviewed it the next morning with a clear head. This is where most people stop. They know they are tired. They work anyway. And they confuse the act of continuing with the act of producing. The truth is that working through your biological trough does not demonstrate strength. It demonstrates a misunderstanding of how the system you are working with actually functions. An athlete who trains through injury does not get stronger. They accumulate damage. The same principle governs your cognitive output. Pushing through depletion does not produce more work. It produces more hours of performance of work, which you already know is not the same thing. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And one of the most common ways to wear that costume convincingly is to sit at a desk, exhausted, and call it commitment. The architecture that high performers have quietly used for decades is not mysterious. It is biological. Work in alignment with your peak energy window, which for most people falls in the first 2 to 4 hours after waking, before the social world begins to demand your attention. Protect that window with the same seriousness you would protect a meeting with the most important person in your professional life. Then rest. Not as a reward. Not as something you earn after enough visible effort. As a structural component of the next output cycle. Roger Federer slept 12 hours per day during competitive seasons. Not because he was soft. Because he understood that his performance the next day was built on the night before. LeBron James has invested over $1 million annually in recovery. Not indulgence. Infrastructure. These are not exceptional people making exceptional choices. These are disciplined professionals who understand a basic biological truth that most office workers have been culturally trained to ignore. Recovery is not the opposite of performance. Recovery is the mechanism that enables the next performance. The truth is that you cannot think your way to more hours. You can only protect the quality of the hours you have. And protecting that quality begins the night before, with sleep that is treated as a professional obligation, not a lifestyle preference. It continues with a morning that does not begin by handing your attention to a phone screen before your brain has completed its natural waking process. And it is sustained through the day by reading your own energy signals honestly and responding to them with recovery rather than caffeine and forced continuation. This is not soft advice. This is operational precision. The person who manages their energy deliberately will consistently outproduce the person who manages their calendar obsessively, because the calendar tells you when to work, and energy determines what that work is actually worth. You now understand that the container is time, the shape of that container is constraint, and the substance inside it is energy. You understand that more hours without managed energy are just more empty containers. You understand that recovery is not weakness. It is the infrastructure of sustained output. Now the question becomes structural. You understand what to protect and why. But where exactly does the real work happen? And how do you build the conditions that make it possible every single day without relying on motivation or perfect circumstances? Chapter 4. Structure your most dangerous hours. Energy without structure is potential without direction. You can be rested, clear, and operating at full cognitive capacity and still spend the peak state answering emails and attending meetings that could have been a single paragraph in a shared document. The quality of your energy determines the ceiling of your output. The structure of your day determines whether you ever reach that ceiling. Most people design their days reactively. The calendar fills from the outside in. Meetings are scheduled in the morning because people feel productive and want to gather then. Requests arrive and get accommodated. The inbox sets the agenda. And the work that actually requires the deepest thinking, the work that only that specific person can do at the level it deserves, gets pushed to the afternoon, to the evening, to tomorrow, to the mythical open slot that never materializes. That work lives permanently on the list and never gets the hours it requires. The truth is that most professionals never do their best work. Not because they are incapable of it. Because they never protect the conditions under which it becomes possible. Cal Newport spent years studying the performance patterns of academics, writers, programmers, and executives before arriving at a distinction that reframes the entire conversation about productivity. He called it deep work. Cognitively demanding tasks performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive capabilities to their limit and produce output that is both valuable and difficult to replicate. The opposite of deep work is not rest. It is shallow work. Email, scheduling, status updates, and routine administrative tasks can be performed at low cognitive intensity and, in many cases, by almost anyone. Most professionals spend the majority of their working hours in shallow work. They spend their best hours, their peak energy window, on the tasks that require the least of them. And they wonder why their most important work never seems to move. Most people react to a full calendar by working around it. You choose to build the calendar before the requests arrive. The highest output individuals throughout history shared one structural pattern that cuts across every field and every era. They protected their creative and intellectual work in tight, defined blocks and treated those blocks as categorically non-negotiable. Charles Darwin worked in 2 focus sessions per day and spent the rest of his time walking, reading, and thinking without an agenda. He produced work that restructured the entire field of biology. Charles Dickens wrote every morning and refused visitors every afternoon without exception. He produced 15 novels, hundreds of short stories, and sustained one of the most commercially successful writing careers in the history of English literature. Maya Angelou rented a hotel room specifically to remove herself from all domestic comfort and force her brain into productive constraint. She brought nothing but her work and stayed until the session was complete. None of these people was available all day. None of them answered every request as soon as it arrived. None of them let the world's demands schedule their most important hours. They built the structure first and let everything else organize around it. The design of a deep work block is not complicated, but every element matters, and none of them are optional. A defined start time. A defined end time. A single task was identified the night before. And complete removal of all competing stimuli. Not reduction. Removal. The phone does not go to silent in the same room. It leaves the room. The browser closes entirely, not minimized, closed. Notifications are not paused. They are eliminated for the duration of the block. The environment is engineered to make distraction mechanically difficult rather than relying on willpower to resist it, because willpower is a finite and depleting resource, and the distractions competing for your attention were designed by teams of behavioral scientists whose entire professional purpose is to make their interruption feel more urgent than your most important work. This is where most people stop. They agree with the principle, and then they leave their phone face down on the desk, as if the device's physical proximity does not itself consume a measurable portion of working memory simply by being present. Research from the University of Texas confirmed exactly this. The mere presence of a smartphone on a desk, even face down and silent, reduces available cognitive capacity. Not because you are using it. Because part of your brain is perpetually allocating resources to not using it. Remove it from the room. This is not a suggestion about preference. It is an instruction about cognitive architecture. The night before protocol is the step that makes everything else work. Every high-output professional who has examined their own performance patterns arrives at the same observation. The decision about what to work on must be made before the morning arrives. When you wake up uncertain about what the first task is, your brain spends its highest energy of the day in a planning and decision loop rather than in execution. Pre-deciding is not an organization for its own sake. It is the act of ensuring that when your peak energy window opens, the only thing required of you is to begin. Identify one task the night before. 1. Not a list. Not a priority ranking. One task that, if completed to its full potential during the morning block, would make the rest of the day either easier or less important. Write it down. Place it somewhere visible for the morning. Then do not revisit the decision. It is made. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And one of the most sophisticated versions of that costume is the professional who fills their mornings with shallow work, feels genuinely busy throughout, and arrives at the end of the day having never touched the one thing that actually mattered. The truth is that structure is not a constraint on freedom. Structure is what makes freedom possible. The writer who protects the morning does not lose their afternoon. They gain it, clean and clear, with the most important work already behind them. The executive who blocks the first 90 minutes from all meetings does not become less responsive. They become more valuable because the work they produce in those 90 minutes is the work that justifies everything else they do. You now understand that energy requires a container and that container must be built deliberately, in advance, and defended with the same seriousness as the work itself. You understand that deep work does not happen by accident. It happens by design. But a design without understanding the forces that will attack it is incomplete. Because the structure you build will face pressure from every direction, from culture, from colleagues, from your own psychology. And the most effective response to that pressure is not defense. It is elimination. Chapter 5. Cut what costs you output. You have built the structure. You have protected the hours. You have identified the one task. And then someone schedules a meeting at 9 in the morning, and you accept it, because declining feels impolite, and the culture around you treats availability as professionalism. The structure dissolves before it ever produces anything. And you tell yourself you will protect the time tomorrow. Tomorrow arrives with its own 9 o'clock meeting. This is not a time management problem. This is an elimination problem. And most professionals never solve it because solving it requires a form of courage that no productivity system can provide. The courage to be less available. The courage to say no to things that feel important but are not. The courage to be measured entirely on what you produce rather than on how present and responsive and accommodating you appear to be. The truth is that every yes is a no to something else. This is not a figure of speech. It is a precise description of how finite attention and finite energy actually work. Every meeting you accept is a focus block you have surrendered. Every obligation added to the calendar increases the cognitive load on the brain carrying your most important work. Every request accommodated at the cost of your protected time is a transaction where you traded your highest value output for someone else's lower priority need. Warren Buffett has stated plainly that the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. Not as a personality trait. Not arrogance. As a resource management decision made with full awareness of the acceptance costs. Most people react to incoming requests by evaluating whether they can fit them in. You choose to evaluate whether they deserve the cost. The Pareto principle, the observation that roughly 80% of results come from approximately 20% of activities, is one of the most consistently verified patterns in business, science, and human behavior. Applied honestly to any professional's week, it is almost always confirmed with uncomfortable accuracy. The majority of meetings produce outcomes that could have been achieved with a 3-sentence email. The majority of emails require no response at all. The majority of projects on the active list are not advancing the core objective. They are creating the sensation of momentum while the real work waits in the same position it occupied last Monday. Identifying your 20% is not difficult. The difficulty is in what comes after the identification. Because eliminating the 80% means stopping things. It means declining invitations. It means not responding to messages that feel urgent but are not. It means being the person in the room who says, calmly and without apology, that they are not available for that meeting and will send a written summary of their position instead. This is where most people stop. Not because they do not understand the principle. They understand it clearly. They stop because elimination carries a social cost that addition does not. Adding a commitment signals enthusiasm, cooperation, and team investment. Declining a commitment signals something the culture interprets as coldness, arrogance, or a lack of dedication. The social reward structure of most professional environments actively punishes the behavior that produces the highest output. The high performer understands this and makes the trade anyway. Not because they are indifferent to relationships or reputation, but because they have decided that the quality of their output is a higher professional obligation than the performance of availability. And they have observed over time that the people whose work is genuinely exceptional are forgiven their boundaries in ways that people whose work is merely adequate never are. Excellence is the permission structure. Build the excellence first, and the boundaries become negotiable. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And the most expensive version of that costume is the professional who cannot say no, who fills every hour with other people's priorities, and who arrives at the end of the quarter having been endlessly available and having produced nothing that moved their own most important work forward by a single measurable step. The truth is that elimination is an act of respect, not dismissal. When you protect your focus block from a low-value meeting, you are not dismissing the people in that meeting. You are respecting the work that only you can do at the level it deserves. When you decline a request that does not belong in your 20%, you are not being selfish. You are being precise about where your highest contribution actually lives. There is a practical architecture for this that removes the emotional weight from individual decisions. Decide in advance, not in the moment. Create a filter. Ask of every new request a single question. Does this directly advance the one result I am currently being measured on, or does it create the appearance of contribution without delivering it? If the answer is the second, the request is no. Not maybe. Don't let me check my calendar. No, delivered with clarity and without extended justification. Justification is a trap. When you over-explain a boundary, you are implicitly suggesting that the boundary requires defense, that your time is not obviously valuable enough to protect without a detailed argument. The high-output professional does not argue for their time. They protect it quietly and consistently and let the work speak for what that protection was worth. The truth is that you cannot do your best work while doing everything. These two things are structurally incompatible. The brain, spread across 20 commitments, is not operating in depth on any of them. It is skimming the surface of each one, producing work that is acceptable but never exceptional, moving forward on everything, and arriving nowhere in particular. You now understand what to protect, how to structure it, and what to remove from around it. You have the container, the energy to fill it, and the clarity about what does not belong inside it. But there is one more force operating against everything you have built so far. A force so deeply embedded in modern professional culture that most people do not even recognize it as a problem. They call it productivity. They call it efficiency. They call it staying on top of things. It is none of those things. Chapter 6. One thing. No exceptions. There is a version of busyness that feels like mastery. The professional who has 4 windows open, 2 conversations running, a document being edited in one corner of the screen while a presentation loads in another, a phone call on speaker, and a reply gets typed in real time. They look capable. They look in control. They look like someone who has learned to do more with the same 24 hours everyone else receives. They are producing less than half of what they are capable of. Not because they lack ability. Because the brain they are using to do all of those things simultaneously is not actually doing any of them. It is switching between them. Rapidly, repeatedly, and at a cost that compounds invisibly across every hour of the day until the cumulative damage to the quality of the output becomes undeniable, but by then the day is over, and the work has already been submitted. The truth is that multitasking is not a skill. It is a myth with a precise neuroscientific refutation. The human brain does not possess the architecture to process 2 cognitively demanding tasks in genuine parallel. What it does instead is toggle. It allocates attention to one task, then pulls it away and redirects it to the second, then pulls it back again and returns to the first. Each toggle carries what researchers call a switching cost, a period of cognitive recalibration during which the brain is not fully present on either task. It is in transition. It is loading. And while it is loading, it is not producing. Gloria Mark and her team at the University of California, Irvine spent years measuring this effect in real professional environments. Their finding was specific, and it should be uncomfortable to anyone who believes they work well with interruptions. After a task interruption, the average worker takes 23 minutes to fully return to the original task at the level of engagement they had before the interruption occurred. Not 23 minutes of wasted time. 23 minutes of degraded cognitive function on the task they believed they returned to immediately. Most people react to an interruption by resuming the task. You choose to understand that resuming and returning are not the same thing. Now multiply that switching cost across a standard workday. The average knowledge worker, operating in an open office environment or with messaging platforms running in the background, experiences dozens of interruptions per hour. Some of them are external. A notification, a colleague, a message that arrives with a sound or a visual signal that the brain is physiologically wired to orient toward because novelty and potential social information are deeply encoded threat and reward triggers. Some of them are internal. The self-generated impulse to check, to refresh, to confirm, to look at the thing that was not important 10 minutes ago, but has somehow become urgent in the absence of any new information about it. Every one of those interruptions is not just a moment of lost focus. It is the beginning of a 23-minute recovery period, and the next interruption will cut it short before it completes. The professional operating in this environment is never fully present on anything. They are in a permanent state of partial attention, producing permanently partial work, and measuring their output by the volume of things touched rather than the depth of anything completed. This is where most people stop. They acknowledge that distraction is a problem in the abstract while keeping every notification active, every tab open, and every messaging platform set to alert them the moment anything arrives. They treat the problem as a matter of personal discipline when it is actually a matter of environmental design. And they lose the argument every single day because they are bringing willpower to a fight designed by behavioral scientists to defeat it. The platforms generating these interruptions were not built carelessly. They were built by some of the most sophisticated engineering and psychology teams in the world, whose explicit professional objective is to make their notification feel more urgent than whatever you were doing before it arrived. You are not failing to concentrate because you lack discipline. You are failing to concentrate because you are operating inside an environment that was deliberately engineered to prevent sustained concentration. Recognizing this is not an excuse. An accurate diagnosis leads to the correct solution. The solution is not resistance. It is removal. The notification does not get silenced. It gets turned off entirely. The tab does not get minimized. It gets closed. The phone does not go face down on the desk. Research from a University of Texas confirmed that the mere presence of a smartphone within visual range reduces available cognitive capacity even when the device is silent and face down, because part of the brain is continuously allocating resources to the act of not reaching for it. The device leaves the room. This is not a dramatic gesture. It is an architectural decision about what gets access to your attention during the hours that matter most. Single tasking is the operational expression of everything this audiobook is building toward. One task. Identified the night before. Begun without negotiation. Sustained without interruption for the full depth of the session. Completed before the next task is even considered. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And the busiest version of that costume is the person toggling between 15 things at high speed, feeling productive because the motion never stops, and producing nothing at the depth that their actual capability would permit if they gave one thing their complete, undivided, uninterrupted attention. The truth is that your attention is not simply your most valuable professional resource. It is the only resource that is genuinely yours to allocate. Money can be recovered. Time cannot be recovered. But attention can be stolen without your awareness, redirected without your consent, and fragmented without your permission, all while you believe you are fully present and working at capacity. Protect the one thing. Not most of the time. Every time. Without exception. You now understand the mechanics of distraction and the architecture of focus. You understand that the brain works in one direction at full depth or in many directions at fractional depth, and that fractional depth is where careers go to produce acceptable work when they were built for exceptional work. But all of this, the structure, the energy, the elimination, the single task, requires one more thing to sustain itself across days and weeks and months, rather than just this Tuesday when the ideas are fresh and the motivation is present. It requires recovery that is as disciplined as the work itself. Chapter 7. Rest as your output depends on it. At some point in the last several decades, exhaustion became a credential. The professional who slept 5 hours, skipped lunch, and worked through the weekend began to be held up as the model of serious commitment. Tiredness became a signal of dedication. Recovery became something you did when the work allowed it, which meant recovery rarely happened at all, because the work never voluntarily created the space. This reframing did not make anyone more productive. It made entire industries chronically depleted, operating at a permanent fraction of their actual capacity, and collectively convinced that the exhaustion was the price of excellence rather than the proof that excellence was being systematically undermined. The truth is that rest is not the opposite of performance. Rest is the mechanism that enables the next performance. These are not competing ideas. They are a single biological system, and treating one half of the system as optional does not produce more output. It degrades the output you are already capable of, slowly enough that the degradation is difficult to attribute to its actual cause, but consistently enough that the work you produce on insufficient recovery is measurably inferior to the work you produce when the system is properly maintained. Most people react to tiredness by pushing through it. You choose to treat recovery as a professional obligation with the same non-negotiable status as the work itself. Roger Federer slept an average of 12 hours per day during competitive seasons. Not occasionally. Consistently. Not as a personality preference, but as a performance protocol. LeBron James has publicly allocated more than $1 million annually to recovery infrastructure, sleep specialists, bodywork, and nutritional support, all intended to ensure that the next performance is not borrowed from the reserves of the previous one. These are not soft people. These are among the most disciplined competitors in the history of their respective fields. And their relationship to recovery is not separate from their discipline. It is an expression of it. The biology here is not ambiguous. During sleep, the brain's glymphatic system becomes significantly more active, clearing metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking cognitive activity. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, impulse control, sustained focus, and the kind of complex reasoning that knowledge work requires, is among the brain regions most acutely sensitive to sleep deprivation. Research published by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine demonstrated that 17 to 19 hours without sleep produces cognitive impairment equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. 24 hours without sleep is equivalent to 0.1%, which is above the legal driving limit in most countries. You are not working harder when you are exhausted. You are working legally impaired and calling it commitment. This is where most people stop. They know they are not rested. They continue anyway because the cultural narrative around them has made rest feel like a character defect rather than a biological requirement. They have internalized the idea that needing sleep is a weakness, that the person who needs less sleep is somehow more serious, more driven, more worthy of the result they are pursuing. This belief is not just incorrect. It is operationally expensive. Every decision made in a sleep-deprived state, every piece of work produced under chronic depletion, every strategic choice arrived at through a prefrontal cortex running on insufficient recovery is a lower-quality version of what that same brain would have produced with a system properly restored. The ultradian rhythm discussed in an earlier chapter not only governs the work cycle, it governs the recovery cycle with equal precision. The 90 to 120-minute wave of high cognitive output that the brain can produce is followed by a physiological trough that signals a genuine neurological need for reduced demand. A 10 to 20-minute period of genuine rest during this trough, whether through a brief non-sleep deep rest, a short nap, or simply a period of low-stimulus physical movement, has been shown in sleep research to restore alertness and cognitive function to a level nearly equivalent to a full sleep cycle for the next working block. The professional who takes this recovery deliberately and on schedule is not being indulgent. They are servicing the equipment that everything else depends on. The professional who overrides it and pushes into the next focus block without recovery is not being disciplined. They are producing degraded work and wearing a costume of endurance, while the quality of their output quietly attests to the cost. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And working while exhausted is the most convincing version of that costume, because it looks exactly like dedication from the outside while producing exactly the opposite of excellence on the inside. The night before is where the next day's performance is built. Not in the last desperate hour of work before midnight. Not in the final email sent at 11:45 to signal that you were still available. In the quality and duration of the sleep that follows. The professional who treats the end of the day as carelessly as they treat the beginning will arrive at tomorrow's peak energy window with a system that has not been restored, operating a brain that is pretending to be sharp while running measurably below capacity. The truth is, the most disciplined thing a high performer does every single day is to stop. Not because the work is finished. The work is never finished. But because stopping on schedule is the mechanism by which tomorrow's performance is protected from today's depletion. Stopping is not surrender. Stopping is an investment. It is the recognition that the resource doing the work is biological, not mechanical, and that biological systems do not respond to overuse the way machines do. Machines slow down. Biological systems break. You now understand that the work requires energy. Energy requires recovery, and recovery requires the same deliberate protection as the work itself. You have the structure. You have a single task. You have eliminated what does not belong. You have protected the recovery that sustains it all. But all of this remains a set of behaviors. And behaviors, as you will now discover, are only as stable as the identity that is doing them. Chapter 8. Become what you protect. Every system eventually meets the same enemy. Not a distraction. Not a bad week. Not a difficult month or an unusually demanding client, or a season of life that makes the structure hard to maintain. Every system eventually meets the story you tell about who you are. And if that story is not aligned with the system, the story wins. Every time. Without exception. Because behavior is downstream of identity. And identity is the deepest operating system any human being runs. You can fully understand Parkinson's law. You can know the ultradian rhythm by name and duration. You can have read every word of this audiobook with full comprehension and a genuine intention to apply it. And then Monday arrives, and the calendar fills from the outside in, and the phone stays on the desk, and the meeting gets accepted, and the morning block dissolves before it ever produced anything. And you tell yourself that this week was unusual and that next week you will implement the system properly. Next week arrives with the same story. The truth is that this is not a failure of knowledge. It is a failure of identity. You know what to do. The gap between knowing and doing is not an information gap. It is the self-concept. It is the image you hold of who you are when no one is watching, when the social cost of a boundary becomes real, when protecting your most important hours means being the person in the room who declines the meeting that everyone else attends. Most people react to that social pressure by abandoning the structure. You choose to let the structure define who you become. The framework of identity-based behavioral change has been rigorously examined in behavioral psychology and performance research. Its central finding is consistent and precise. Behavior that is attached to identity sustains itself with significantly less effort than behavior that is attached to outcome. When you are trying to produce 4 hours of deep work to finish the project, the behavior requires continuous motivation and willpower to sustain. When you are someone who does 4 hours of deep work every morning because that is what you do and who you are, the behavior becomes the natural expression of your self-concept rather than a constant negotiation with competing impulses. The shift is subtle in description and significant in practice. It is the difference between saying I am trying to protect my mornings and saying I do not take meetings before noon. The first statement is aspirational. It signals that the behavior is not yet stable and that pressure might move it. The second statement is identity. It is not open for negotiation because it is not a goal. It is a description of who you are. This is where most people stop. Not because the identity shift is difficult to understand. Because making it requires confronting and letting go of an older identity that the professional world has rewarded for years. The identity of the person who is always available. Always responsive. Always willing to make room for one more request, one more meeting, one more task that belongs to someone else's priority list. That identity has been socially validated and professionally rewarded. It feels safe. It feels like proof of value. It is the costume. And the costume has been so consistently praised that taking it off feels like exposure rather than liberation. The high-output professional does not measure their value by hours of visible presence. They measure it by what was moved, what was built, and what result exists in the world that would not exist without their specific contribution. This is a fundamentally different operating system. And installing it requires not just new behaviors, but also a new answer to the question that every professional implicitly answers with every decision they make. Who am I, and what does someone like me do with a morning? Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And the deepest reason most people keep wearing the costume is that they have built their professional identity around it. Being busy is how they know they matter. Being needed is how they know they are valuable. Being responsive is how they prove they are serious. Remove the busyness, and they are left with the only measurement that actually matters: the output, which has to be good enough to stand on its own without the surrounding performance. That is what the identity shift demands. It demands that you become someone willing to be measured by results alone. Without the theater. Without the visible effort. Without the performance of dedication as a substitute for the delivery of it. The truth is that you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems and your self-concept. Willpower is weather. It changes without notice and cannot be built upon as a primary structural support. Identity is infrastructure. It does not fluctuate with motivation, mood, or the difficulty of the current week. It is the stable foundation from which all consistent behavior grows. Build the identity first. Not the habit. Not the schedule. Not the 4-hour block, the single task, and the removed phone. Those are expressions of the identity, not the identity itself. Identity is the decision about who you are. The decision that you are someone who produces exceptional work in compressed, protected, deliberate time. Someone who does not perform availability. Someone who is not always reachable because the work that deserves their full attention is not compatible with being always reachable. Make that decision. Hold it as a description of who you already are, not a goal you are working toward. And then let every behavioral choice be the natural expression of the person you have already decided to become. You now understand that the system requires an identity to sustain it, and that the identity requires a decision that precedes every subsequent behavior. You have everything required to build the output architecture that this audiobook has been constructing from the beginning. There is one final principle that binds every chapter together. One discipline that is older than productivity science, older than performance research, older than any framework discussed in these pages. It is the discipline that makes all of the others not just possible but inevitable. Chapter 9. The Discipline of Doing Less Better. Epictetus was born into slavery in the Roman Empire. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing about the external conditions of his existence. And from that position, with no resources, no freedom, and no guarantee of tomorrow, he produced a philosophy of performance and self-governance that has outlasted every empire that surrounded him and continues to be studied by military leaders, executives, athletes, and anyone who has seriously confronted the question of how to produce their best work inside conditions they did not choose. His central instruction was not motivational. It was operational. Distinguish clearly between what is within your control and what is not. Give your complete, undivided effort to the former. Release your grip on the latter entirely. Not reluctantly. Not as a consolation. As a deliberate strategic choice made by someone who understands that energy spent on the uncontrollable is energy stolen from the work that can actually be moved. Applied to the modern professional, this principle is not ancient wisdom offered for comfort. It is a precise and practical operating rule. The meeting culture of your organization is largely outside your control. The demands of your clients are largely outside your control. The economy, the market, and the decisions of people above you in any hierarchy are largely outside your control. What is within your control is the quality of the work you produce in the hours you have protected, the decisions you make about where your attention goes, and the standard you hold for what you allow to carry your name. Most people react to the uncontrollable by spending their best energy trying to manage it. You choose to release it and return your full weight to what can actually be moved. This is the discipline of doing less better. Not doing less as an act of laziness or indifference. Doing less as an act of precision. Identifying with surgical accuracy the work that only you can do at the level it deserves, protecting the conditions under which that work becomes possible, and releasing everything else with the calm of someone who has decided that their contribution to the world will be defined by depth, not volume. The temptation in professional life runs in the opposite direction. More is visible. More signal effort. More creates the impression of someone who is serious, indispensable, and in demand. The inbox with 500 unread messages looks important. The calendar with back-to-back meetings looks like a value. The person who is copied on every email and invited to every meeting seems to be the center of the operation. They are the center of the performance. The output belongs to someone else. Someone quieter. Someone less visible. Someone who said no to the meeting and yes to the 3 hours of uninterrupted work that produced the thing the meeting was called to discuss. This is where most people stop. They understand the principle of doing less better in the abstract, genuinely agree with it, and then return to adding another commitment. Another yes. Another obligation is placed on the calendar because the alternative, the deliberate, defended, empty space required for the deepest work, feels uncomfortably close to doing nothing. And doing nothing has been so thoroughly condemned by the surrounding culture that even intentional emptiness triggers guilt. The guilt is the cost of recognizing that it is being removed. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. And the final thing to understand about that costume is that the people around you will sometimes be uncomfortable when you stop wearing it. When you calmly decline the meeting, when you protect the morning without apology, when you leave at a reasonable hour because the real work is already done, some people will interpret this as a signal that you are not serious. They are measuring you by the costume they are still wearing. Let them. Your work will provide a different kind of evidence. The truth is that less done with complete attention and full cognitive depth will always produce more than more done with divided attention and depleted energy. This is not philosophy. It is the operational conclusion of every principle covered in these pages. Parkinson's law confirms that constraint produces output. Energy management confirms that depletion degrades quality. Deep work confirms that distraction reduces the ceiling on every task it touches. Single tasking confirms that divided attention yields fractional results. Identity confirms that behavior endures only when it is rooted in self-concept rather than in motivation. All of them point in the same direction. Fewer things. Chosen with precision. Done completely. At the highest level you are capable of. Without the performance surrounding them. Without the theater of busyness filling the hours that the real work does not require. This is the standard. Not 8 hours of visible effort. 4 hours of genuine, defended, energized, single-tasked, structurally protected output that produces more than 8 ever could, because depth is always more powerful than duration when the work requires thinking rather than repetition. Epictetus produced his entire philosophy in a single room with no possessions. Darwin restructured biology into 2 sessions per day. Dickens built one of the most enduring bodies of work in the English language between breakfast and noon. The pattern is not accidental. It is the same principle operating across different centuries, different fields, and different circumstances. The people who produce the most significant work are not the people who work the most hours. They are the people who protect the fewest hours with the most discipline and bring their fullest selves to those hours every single time. You now have the complete architecture. The law that governs how time behaves under constraint. The energy management determines what fills the time. The structure that protects the energy. The elimination that defends the structure. The single task that focuses the energy. The recovery restores the system. the identity that sustains the behavior, and the ancient discipline that binds it all together into a way of working that is not dependent on motivation, perfect circumstances, or a culture that understands what you are doing. There is one chapter remaining. Not to introduce a new concept. To close the architecture completely and hand it to you in a form that requires only one thing from this moment forward. Chapter 10. Fewer things. Fully done. Every principle in this audiobook has been building toward a single operational conclusion. Not a philosophy to admire from a distance. Not a framework to reference when circumstances are favorable. A daily practice. A decision is made each morning before the world has a chance to make it for you. A standard held not because someone is watching, but because the work deserves it, and you have decided that you are someone who gives the work what it deserves. This is the final chapter, and it asks only one thing of you. Not enthusiasm, not inspiration, not the feeling of readiness that most people wait for before beginning. It asks for a decision, made now. Held without negotiation. Expressed not in what you intend to do, but in what you actually do with tomorrow morning. The truth is that everything you have heard in these pages already exists inside your understanding of how you work at your best. You have felt the difference between a day when you produced something real and a day when you were simply present. You have known the particular exhaustion of a day spent entirely in shallow work, the hollow tiredness of having been busy all day and having nothing to show for it that you are genuinely proud of. You have also known, even briefly, the different quality of tiredness that follows a day where the important work was done early and done completely. The tiredness of output rather than performance. You already know the difference. What this audiobook has given you is the architecture that makes the better version repeatable rather than accidental. Most people react to that architecture by waiting for the right week to begin. You choose to begin with the next available morning. Not the perfect morning. The next one. Parkinson's law told you that the time you give a task is the time it will consume. Give less. Compress the deadline. Trust the constraint to activate what the open calendar never will. The work that you have been circling for 2 weeks will be done by Thursday if Thursday is the only option you give yourself. Energy management told you that the hours you work are only as valuable as the energy state you bring to them. Sleep is a professional obligation. Recovery is infrastructure. The peak window is biological, not motivational, and it opens every morning before the world knows you are awake. Use it before you give it away. Deep work told you that the conditions for exceptional output must be built in advance and defended without apology. The phone leaves the room. The block is defined. The task is chosen the night before. The environment is engineered to make distraction mechanically impossible rather than relying on willpower to resist it. Elimination told you that every yes costs a no. The no that protects your most important work is not a failure of generosity. It is the highest professional act available to you. You cannot do your best work while doing everything. This is not a limitation to overcome. It is a condition to accept and to build around. Single tasking told you that depth is always more powerful than breadth. One thing, given your complete undivided attention, will consistently produce more than 5 things given a fifth of your attention each. The toggling brain is not a multitasking brain. It is a brain in constant transition, never fully present anywhere, producing work that reflects the fractional attention it received. Recovery told you that stopping is not surrendering. It is an investment. The most disciplined thing you do today is finish on schedule and restore the system that tomorrow's work depends on. Chronic depletion is not dedication. It is a slow and invisible degradation of the only tool you have. Identity told you that behavior follows the story you tell about who you are. You are not trying to become someone who works differently. You are someone who works differently. That decision is made here in this chapter, and expressed in every calendar decision, every boundary held, and every morning protected that follows. And the discipline of doing less better told you what all of it is for. Not to optimize your schedule. Not to get more tasks crossed off a list. To produce work that only you can produce, at the level it deserves, without the performance of effort surrounding it. Work that stands on its own. Work that moves things. Work that exists in the world because you gave it your best hours instead of your leftover ones. This is where most people stop. They finish the audiobook, feel the clarity of the ideas, and return to Monday exactly as they left Friday. The information becomes one more thing they know that they are not doing. One more framework that made sense in theory and dissolved under the pressure of the inbox, the meeting request, and the cultural expectation of permanent availability. Do not let this be that. Busy is not productive. Busy is a costume. You have now seen the costume clearly enough that you cannot honestly pretend you did not. Every hour spent performing work instead of doing it, every morning surrendered to other people's priorities, every week that ends with the most important work still waiting in the same position it occupied on Monday, you will recognize it now for exactly what it is. The remaining choice is not complicated. It is a single decision about what kind of professional you are going to be from this morning forward. Not from next month. Not from the new quarter. This morning. 4 hours. Protected. Energized. Focused on one thing. Defended without apology. Followed by recovery that is treated with the same seriousness as the work itself. The truth is that you have always been capable of more than your schedule has allowed you to demonstrate. Not more hours. More depth. More precision. More willingness to be measured on what you actually produce rather than on how long you were visibly present in the attempt to produce it. Fewer things. Fully done. Starting now. The clock is already running. The only question that remains is whether the hours on it will be spent or invested. That answer belongs entirely to you. You have just been given a system. Not motivation. Not inspiration. A system. You now know that the 8-hour workday was not built for your output. It was built for factory compliance in a century that has been dead for 100 years. You know that Parkinson's law governs every deadline you have ever missed and every project that took longer than it should have. You know that energy is the real currency, that your brain works in waves, and that pushing through the trough does not produce work, it produces the illusion of work. You know that deep work requires defended time, that multitasking is neurologically impossible, and that the most disciplined thing a high performer does each day is stop on schedule and recover without guilt. You know that identity must precede behavior, that systems outlast motivation, and that doing fewer things with full depth is always more powerful than doing many things with diluted attention. Now comes the only question that matters. Not whether this system is real. It is. Not whether it would work for you. It would. The only question is whether you are willing to be the person in the room who is seen doing less, protecting their time, saying no to meetings, and leaving early because the real work is already done. Most people will nod at this. Most people will agree with everything in these 90 minutes and change nothing on Monday. You are not most people. Prove it with your calendar tomorrow morning. Not with your intentions. Your calendar. The work is waiting. Protect the hours that belong to it.